Welcome everybody to the second episode of Connect the Dots, your podcast about asymmetric investing opportunities. Thank you very much for joining today. Today, Simon and I are very excited to welcome key members of the management team of Strata Critical Medical, ticker symbol SRTA. We are joined today by Will Heyburn, co-CEO and CFO, Melissa Tomkiel, co-CEO and General Counsel and Director, and Matt Schneider, CFO and of Clinical Services and VP of Finance and Investor Relations. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. And we are really looking forward to learning more about Strata, the business model, the growth opportunities, and the long-term vision of the company. Before we start, a quick disclaimer, as always, nothing in this conversation should be understood as financial advice or investment advice. This discussion is only for information and educational purposes, and podcast guests might have positions in the securities discussed. With that, I would like to hand it over to Simon for the first question on the business overview. Simon, it's your stage now.
Yeah, thank you so much for the amazing introduction. Also a warm welcome from my side. It's an absolute honor to have you here with us today. And I would say let's dive in. So let's start with the basics for our audience. I would say, could you walk us through what Strata Critical Medical does actually, like the journey from Blade Air Mobility, the rebrand, the divestiture of your passenger segment to Joby Aviation? It would be really nice to have a quick roundup of what your company is actually doing.
Sure, Simon. First, thanks both to you and Max for having us on today. We really appreciate it. Thanks for everybody for listening. So Strata Critical Medical is a critical logistics and clinical services company for the healthcare industry. And really where we focus is in the transplant community, so organ transplants in the United States. And the reason that this is an area that we're very focused is because this is a motion where time is of the essence. The hearts, livers, and lungs, where we're helping our customers primarily, have only hours to get from a donor to a recipient. So it requires dedicated aircraft that are moving just that one organ by itself to get it to the recipient in time. It also requires clinical services that we provide directly, including surgeons that can help go remove those organs from donors, and also folks called perfusionists and equipment that they bring along with them that can pump oxygenated blood through organs and repair damage that can be done to them when a donor deceases. So we put all of this together in what we call a one-call solution for the transplant centers, which are hospitals that have a patient that's going to receive an organ, and organ procurement organizations, which are the groups that find donors and prepare them for the transplant process. So we put all of this together so they can make one phone call and get everything they need harmonized in the most economical and cost-effective way possible. We have a network of aircraft across the country, able to go at a moment's notice to go pick up an organ when it becomes available. And we also have surgeons and perfusionists that are co-located with those assets so we can put it all together and eliminate unnecessary flying, which we call repositioning. That's flying a plane when it's empty. It costs customers a lot of money, and it limits the amount of time they have to go recover these organs from recipients. We can use a lot of these same resources that we have, particularly the perfusionists, to also help regional hospitals when they're providing open heart surgical services to folks in their community. These are hospitals that don't have enough volume of these kind of surgeries to justify having their own heart-lung bypass machines or having their own perfusionists on site. So we regionally pool these resources, and we help hundreds of hospitals across the United States be able to deliver these services to the communities that they serve. So we're really excited to be a part of this mission, and it's been an interesting journey, as you alluded to, Simon. I'll turn over to Melissa to talk a little bit more about how we got here.
Sure. Thanks, Will, and thank you guys for having us. We launched Blade in 2014 as a platform for urban air mobility. And this allowed people to purchase seats or purchase charters on helicopters or seaplanes in dense urban areas where the infrastructure existed for vertical mobility. And as we progressed along the years, we leveraged the infrastructure we had, particularly having aircraft available to us essentially around the clock and a call center to start doing medical missions, which we began right here in New York City in 2018. And we began first by starting with the last mile missions from connecting organs that were deplaning at local airports like Teterboro. And rather than having to endure New York City traffic, we would fly them in helicopters to the transplant centers. And that's how we first got started in the medical business. We went public in 2021, and along with that came a significant amount of funds, about $300 million, that we quickly invested in this medical business, seeing that this was really the industry that we wanted to get involved with. And what we did then was we acquired one of our logistics partners that was called Trinity, and that is our logistics branch today. We quickly became the largest provider of air transportations of hearts, livers, and lungs in the country. And as we were kind of, had both businesses existing simultaneously, all the technology really started developing in electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, or eVTOL. And we realized that the passenger business really belonged in an eVTOL company and industry, because eVTOL is really the unlock for vertical aviation, particularly in urban areas. And our focus was really more on the medical space. We also didn't feel that the companies together were yielding the appropriate valuation in public markets. And so we executed the divestiture of the passenger business to Joby, which is a manufacturer of eVTOL. And then, very quickly he became a pure play medical provider.
Yeah, that's like it's really interesting, like the whole journey of the company. Yeah, Will already mentioned the one call platform. We come to that later. Thank you so much for highlighting all like the business in total. Thank you so much for that. On May 6th, you published your Q1 2026 financial and operational results. And the market was really happy about that. Actually, the stock went up. So can you quickly walk us through the recent numbers?
Sure. We had a really strong start to the year. Our total revenue is up about almost 90% year over year. Organically, which is our logistics business, grew organically approximately 30%. And that's revenue and gross profit. Our clinical business, which represents the Keystone business that we acquired, grew significantly sequentially. We think that was one of the biggest takeaways from the quarter, driven by our transplant clinical business. Our clinical business overall grew revenue approximately 13% sequentially, and gross profit increased almost 30% sequentially. So a big step up in that business, which is great to see not long after we closed the acquisition. The last point I'll make is, after several cash-related transaction items in the second half of the year, we generated operating and free cash flow in the quarter. So a great start to the year. And we, at the time when we announced our earnings, we reiterated our guidance for the year.
Yeah, amazing. That sounds really positive, and is also really valuable for all the shareholders. Amazing. Congratulations on that, actually.
Very good. Then I will take over with the next question. I think you already touched a bit on the business model, but maybe one thing I would here quickly point out is, for investors tuning in the first time, why, in your opinion, is this an attractive industry? And what basically does the organic growth profile for the business look like in the next years?
Sure, Max. And maybe is it kind of a preamble to that? Just really quickly, I'll explain how the industry works in terms of the different components here. So we talked about it very briefly earlier, but there's about 50 what are called organ procurement organizations. These groups divide up the United States into territories where they're responsible for identifying the individuals that represent less than 1% of deaths that can qualify for organ donation. So it's very rare. And their job is to identify those donors and then prepare them for the transplant process. They can have some logistical needs because they can cover very large geographic areas. So we'll enter into contracts with them both to fly their staff and supplies around the area that they're responsible for, and also to provide something called NRP, normothermic regional perfusion. And this is a process where you're pumping oxygenated blood through that donor to repair damage that's done to the organs. It allows you to use organs that otherwise you wouldn't be able to use, and it also improves the likelihood that the recipient of that organ is going to be able to use it for a very long time and have a really good outcome. So we also enter into contracts, retainer contracts with those OPOs to provide that service. On the other side of the equation are transplant centers. There's about 250 of them in America, and these are the hospitals that have the patient that's going to receive that organ. We contract with them primarily to provide logistics. They are the quarterbacks for any heart, liver, and lung. So they're going to send an airplane to the location of that donor, and there'll actually be an airplane there often for every individual organ because they can all be going different places. So it's a logistical symphony that has to be organized across multiple hospitals across the country. Everything has to go to a very specific timeline. And when it doesn't, which is some significant percentage of the time, you have to have plan B, C, and D ready to go. This is what we excel at, being able to react and have redundancy in our system to always be able to complete this life-saving mission. So we'll enter into exclusive contracts with transplant centers to do 100% of their flying that they need. And that's what allows us to plan and move airplanes closer to their hospital. So again, you don't have to waste time flying planes that are empty. We can also, for transplant centers, provide services where we help them figure out if they want to accept an organ for one of their recipients. We have clinicians that are there picking up the phone when an OPO calls and says that an organ is available. And finally, we can provide those third-party surgical recovery services. When a transplant center doesn't want to send their own surgeon to go recover that organ, we have our own surgeons based all across the country. And we'll talk more later in the conversation about how that can save folks a lot of money and make the whole system more efficient. So this is sort of the marketplace at a glance, and it's growing very quickly. It's growing because, frankly, it needs to. Sadly, about 15 people die every day in America waiting for an organ that's not going to come in time. The good news is that everyone, regulators, companies like Strata, medical device companies, are all banding together to help close that gap. The couple of ways that the industry is working together on this, one is technology. There are new devices that can help organs survive longer in transit, so you can get an organ that matches someone farther away to the recipient in time. There's more technology, like the technology that we provide, normothermic regional perfusion, that can repair damaged organs and allow us to look at a larger proportion of deaths for potential organ donation. That's increasing the supply and the marketplace. So actually, if you look at the growth and the number of transplants, it's been growing on average mid to high single digits for the last several years. But importantly, if you look at certain segments of organ donors, particularly the areas that we focus on, so there's something called donation after circulatory death. This is the ability to use organs from donors whose hearts have stopped. This is where the damage needs to be prepared through something like normothermic regional perfusion. This is growing at 20% on average. And then when you look within that cohort, the percentage of the organs that are receiving that service where we're the market leader, normothermic regional perfusion, that's gone from 20% of those organs in 2024 to nearly 50% today, and it's continuing to grow. So you can see how our organic growth within Strata can be much faster than the industry, even on an organic basis. And then this is a very fragmented marketplace where we're taking share. We're taking share in logistics, we're taking share in organ recovery using third-party surgeons, and we're taking share in the other clinical services that we provide. So fundamentally, the whole ecosystem is banding together to solve this problem, increase the growth rate in the number of organs, and then there's more on the come. There are more devices coming to market that are going to lower the cost of recovering these organs, making it easier for transplant centers to do. And then regulators are helping as well. It used to be that you had to match organs to a recipient in a very arbitrary geographic box. That's all changing because it resulted in people who needed the organ the most not getting it. So we've seen average distances between donor and recipient increase by about 60% over the last 6 years. They're continuing to evolve those rules to get to the sickest person first, saving more lives. That's why we're doing it. And at Strata, we can uniquely help with that because we have the largest platform of aircraft that are positioned all across the country to solve this problem. And when we think about it from the perspective of, A, we can solve the problem better than the incumbents, so we think we'll win more business. as this transition takes place. But then also from a unit economic perspective, our unit of revenue is an hour of flight time. So there is a benefit there to the economic model. As we're doing the right thing for recipients, we're uniquely able to solve the problem, and then you're increasing the revenue per transplant at the same time. But it's one of those rare win-wins in the healthcare ecosystem because more people get the organs they need that way, and we can help.
That sounds absolutely amazing. And just to touch on what you just said and also on the beginning, like you described Strata as like the only full service provider combining logistics, surgical recovery, NRP, and organ placement under one platform, like you already said, like the OneCall platform. And to me, it sounds like a multifactorial platform. And what I'm interested in is how defensible is this integrated model and why it is so difficult, for example, for new entrants to replicate it.
Well, the only way to operate this platform and this model is to do it at scale, because that's what drives the most efficiencies for the customer. And it allows us to always say yes. So, we, like you said, but with organ placement, right? So we have clinical administrators who are working on behalf and alongside transplant centers to do organ matching and placement. So when an organ is accepted, the next thing that needs to happen is the organ needs to be recovered. Well, we can solve that problem immediately and say yes. It's that easy button. We have clinicians strategically located around the country that can go deploy and do that organ recovery. The next thing that needs to happen is the transportation of that organ, usually by air, back to the transplant center. And again, we can say yes, providing that service and doing it the most efficiently because we will have locally based aircraft, and we have that through the scale that we already have. So traditionally, a transplant center would dispatch an airplane, usually with a transplant surgeon. They would go to the organ donor, retrieve the organ, and fly back. Unfortunately, what happens a significant amount of the time is those organs are not usable. If you have already dispatched an airplane from across the country, you've now wasted the time of that surgeon and you've wasted the money flying that airplane. So that you can only deliver the efficiency by having the locally placed resources and not having to fly unless you know that the organ is viable if you have these hubs around the country. So, we have 20 logistics bases that are strategically placed around the country in the areas of highest volumes for organ donors. We have 35 dedicated aircraft, 10 of which we own, that we control in terms of where we place them and how we dispatch them. We have 13 organ recovery hubs. So those are those clinical resources that I was talking about, where we have our clinicians we have our recovery surgeons and we have our perfusionists that can administer NRP, as well as it allows us to store our supplies and devices, some third-party machine perfusion around the country. Again, so it just really creates that efficiency. You can't do all of this if you're limited in geographic scope and by number of resources. The other piece of this that gives us such a competitive advantage is that we are not tied to any one type of medical equipment. Will was mentioning earlier, it's a great thing for the industry. There's more devices coming to market now than we've ever seen that increase the viability of organs post-procurement. That's a wonderful thing. It saves more lives. It improves outcomes. We can support any one of those devices. It doesn't matter to us. Whatever our transplant center customer wants to use for a case, we have the flexibility through our scale and through being an open source platform to say yes. And we will fly whatever device or move whatever device they want to use.
That really sounds amazing. So it sounds to me that it's like really vertical integrated business with big device variety, which is really important also to know for our listeners. Really interesting. Thank you so much for highlighting that out. Great.
Okay, then I will start with the next part. I think, Will, you already touched on the scale that you're operating on, which is really impressive in my opinion, and to really get it with all the different ecosystem partners to do it in a really efficient process. Maybe one question about the market or the growth drivers, especially beyond market share. In your opinion, what are basically the major growth drivers? So one thing you already touched was the NRP process. So maybe you could walk us through the adoption curve there. Where are we there in the process? That would be very interesting.
Yeah, I think just starting with the growth algorithm, we'll hit on the industry growth rate that's been in the mid to high single digits over the last several years. We're really excited about two secular penetration stories within the industry that we're really tied to following the acquisition of Keystone. So, that our clinical business is exposed to now. So, NRP and third party surgical recovery. NRP has seen increasing penetration rates and growth over the last several years. Going back a few years, less than 5% of DCD donors had NRP. That increased to 20% to 40% is now over half of DCD donors have NRP. And we believe over time that's moving towards the standard of care or higher than we are today. So that's one of them. The other one is third-party surgical recovery, and it's really tied to DCD donation and NRP. So it's happening at the same time. We estimate that last year approximately 40% of DCD cases were using third-party surgical recovery. We're seeing that steadily increase. It's one of the key growth drivers behind our first quarter results that we announced recently. And we're really excited about being able to scale that business, both organically and by adding new customers.
Very good. I think then, Simon, you can start with the next question.
Yeah, I actually want, you already mentioned like DCD. Would you agree on that this part is a structural tailwind? And how much faster is DCD volume growing versus DBD in your opinion?
Well, absolutely. It's a structural tailwind. If you look at the overall transplant volumes, as we talked about, that's a mid to high single digit grower. And then DCD over the last few years has been averaging about 20% growth. And there's a lot more help that transplant centers and organ procurement organizations need to effectuate these much more complex recoveries that are associated with DCD. So, volume is growing much more quickly, but the need for the services we provide is much greater in those kind of cases because of the things that Melissa was talking about earlier. You have about a third of the time in a DCD recovery where unfortunately you go home empty-handed. So there's a risk associated with spending that money to fly an airplane to a location and send a surgeon to a location. And that's why the local service model that we have and are continuing to expand is so critical to making this whole ecosystem more efficient. You simply can't close that gap we're trying to close of those 15 people every day that need organs that they're not going to get if you have surgeons spending all their time in airplanes not performing surgical recoveries. So we're helping the industry to move away from that. And it also, from a cost perspective, it reduces the expense of giving it a shot to recover an organ that on paper looks like it has a good chance of not being used. There's lots of times when transplant centers are looking at labs and they're looking at data around a donor and they're thinking, okay, is it really worth sending an airplane across the country when I think this is a 50-50 shot that the organ's not going to be utilized? If instead we have a surgeon already in that donor location and we have a plane already in that donor location that we can keep on standby, don't have to turn on any engines, don't have to burn any jet fuel, we significantly reduce the cost of taking that risk. And it means that the transplant centers will try more often. And the more often they try, right, it's just math. There's a 50% chance of saving a life. Now you get to try, and you will have the time to save one more life. So that's why we think it's so critical to lower the cost of going after these organs. And that's why we've built and are continuing to expand this network. So we do expect to continue to see outsized growth in DCD because we're breaking down these barriers that are actually inhibiting growth in the fastest growing part of transplant, believe it or not. So as we make it easier, as those additional machine perfusion devices come online that we talked about, that's going to create competition that will lower the cost of that relatively expensive technology, make it more accessible. You have some supply constraints and machine perfusion that'll start to come down. And, again, as Melissa talked about, we're here to be that infrastructure layer and support all of these devices. We still believe that the customer is always right. So we want to be able to say yes to whatever it is they need, and also put it as part of a system that we've created that will make it possible to deploy at the lowest possible cost. So that's what we think we've built, and that's what we're going to continue to make better every single day.
Yeah, amazing. I really like the part what you told about that you always have someone nearby in case of an emergency or whenever something happens. I think that's a big advantage in my opinion. And you already mentioned that new devices coming to your platform, and I also think Max, you have another topic to talk about with new verticals.
Yeah, absolutely. So for Simon and me, it's always a very important part that next to a very strongly growing core business, there are new verticals that can be layered on top of it or adjacent markets and opportunities. And one thing that I think you mentioned in another context was that you said you've started to do trial runs and radio pharmaceutical air transport. So for someone that maybe doesn't know the term, what is it exactly and how significant is that vertical for you going forward?
Well, it's interesting. It's another area of healthcare logistics that has the same problem. It's a compound, a radiopharmaceutical. It can be for diagnostics or to treat a disease that doesn't last very long. It has a short half-life, and so it decays. So after it's manufactured, it has to get to the point of consumption very quickly, just like a donor organ. And so we realize we have this whole infrastructure that's set up to actually do the more complicated thing that, a life is on the line when you're moving a donor organ. And this has a lot of the same attributes, maybe slightly lower stakes, but equally as important for the folks that need it. And so we did what we like to do, which is let's learn by doing. Let's get involved. Let's start performing these services and let's try to do it as much as we can. We're doing trips like this every week now. And let's learn through the process of providing these services, whether it's something we want to invest more in. And it actually follows a template that we've employed every step of the way in our transplant business. As Melissa talked about earlier, we built it organically in New York City on the back of our passenger business that we already had, and we realized we could be great at it. Only after we knew that did we make an investment in terms of an acquisition to grow the platform. But the company that we invested in was one that we had worked with for a long period of time. Same is the case for clinical services. We worked in a commercial partnership with Keystone for quite a while, realizing that there was a benefit to the combined platform. We learned that through our commercial partnership. And only after we were convinced of that through actually doing it, did we go make the acquisition and formally put the two businesses together. So you're seeing us in kind of this phase one on radiopharmaceuticals. We don't know where we're going to land. We know we can do it. We do know we can be great at it. The question is whether it's a good return on investment in terms of trying to grow that business, and time will tell. But I think what you've seen from us is that we have the capability to, at very low cost, run these kind of trials and figure out where we want to go. And we're always thinking about the future in terms of expanding our overall addressable market.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because you basically have that infrastructure and you can, with a few changes, use it for other verticals as well. So I think that's a very interesting opportunity.
And look, I should mention that there's other areas that, we have decided after trials that we want to expand more broadly. Kidney is something we haven't talked about very much because kidneys can survive a little bit longer outside the body and still be transplanted, a day, if not more. Historically, they've been shipped through the cargo sections of commercial airlines. But just like your bag, sadly, sometimes kidneys get lost. So we started with a trial of hand-carrying kidneys in the commercial cabin of a commercial aircraft. And now that's becoming a much larger business for us. It's something we offer to all of our customers because we realize to pay just a little bit extra, you can have almost, absent some kind of weather or diversion, near 100% completion rate for this really critical transport. And so that's a great example of something that we have decided to fully lean into because we think it's a better solution than what's out there in the marketplace otherwise.
The other area that we didn't talk about yet that's kind of another vertical is our other clinical services, which is about 15% of our revenue in the first quarter. So that's the cardiac perfusion. And we think there's a big opportunity to grow that business as well, organically and through acquisition. So it's a fragmented market. Our share is less than 10% today. We provide great value to the customers, and there's synergies with the transplant clinical business because the staff are the same perfusionists that could be used. So if we're doing a recovery somewhere in the country where we have a cardiac perfusion contract, we could leverage that clinical base. So that's another vertical that we're focused on growing as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for breaking that down. Both of you mentioned already two interesting keywords. For example, keystone and acquisition. And I would like to talk a little bit about your acquisition philosophy. And I'm really interested about which value brings Keystone to your platform and what does your ideal acquisition target looks like going forward, especially after your latest acquisition of Ohio Valley Perfusion.
Sure. Well, Keystone was an incredibly strategic acquisition for us because it unlocked our ability to be this fully integrated one-call solution, right? Before Keystone, our primary focus in the organ transplant space was on logistics. So we worked with Keystone, as Will was saying. Keystone was a very key commercial partner for us for years because we saw that customers wanted that easy button, right? They wanted to have all of these services provided to them pretty seamlessly. So we were working with Keystone for surgical recovery and NRP already. So we got to know them. We got to know the leaders there. We realized we shared the same beliefs and values. We saw where the industry was going with the shift towards third-party recovery and the adoption of NRP, and realized that this was a great acquisition for us. So it was huge because it launched us into the clinical business, and again, already at scale. So where we're going from here is we do have this national footprint, this national infrastructure, but there is still room to grow. The industry across all the verticals is still highly fragmented. So, and there are key places on the map that we haven't quite filled in. So, as far as our acquisition strategy, we want to continue to bolt on across all of our verticals and, Ohio Valley, including core perfusion, right? Matt was just talking about that, providing staffing of perfusionists to cardiothoracic centers around the country that are doing open heart surgeries. Well, it's not only its own business line that diversifies us a little bit from organ transplant, but we can cross-pollinate with those resources by having them around the country because those are perfusionists that can also perform NRP. So Ohio Valley was a great example of that. It's a very local, small regional player, but it kind of bridged the gap between locations that we already had a little bit to the south in Kentucky and a little bit further to the north. And, again, like in order to do this the most efficiently, we need those resources, in a variety of places.
Yeah,
And there's a great opportunity, cross-sell across these acquired businesses when we bring them into the platform. Almost it's hard to find a single target out there that's doing even two or three of these things. And there's no one that has this full stack open source solution like we have. So often, you find a clinical target as an example, and their customers are not being very efficient with the logistics to move those clinicians around. So it's something that we can actually provide value to the customer in terms of saving them money. But from our P&L, it's incremental revenue and profit while saving money for the customer. It's that rare win-win. So we always look at ourselves as being aligned with the customer. If we can't save the money, we're not going to try to force them to use our services. But because we put everything together, as Melissa talked about in this national infrastructure program, we're often able to do that.
Thank you so much. So if we jump from the acquisition philosophy to the partner network, it's also really interesting. And is the vision a truly nationwide partner network? And the question I asked myself, are you already seeing potential partners and targets coming to you as the impact of Strata's platform grows?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not just a secret that we have that this only works at scale, right? So a lot of, both on the clinical side and on the logistics side, there's still a lot of local smaller players that are limited to fewer resources. In logistics, for example, maybe only one or two aircraft of the same type that have the same operating capabilities that aren't going to be the most efficient for a diverse variety of missions. So we are having people come to us saying that we can be better together. And in a lot of these instances, kind of like an example I just gave, those companies will continue to be our suppliers. It's not that we're coming in and displacing them. We're adding them to our national infrastructure because it does take a variety of resources to make this work. Not every type of plane is going to be the most efficient for every trip. So you want to be able to have, that variety. So, it's been happening. It happened with Ohio Valley as an example of players seeing what we're doing, and they know that together we're going to be stronger and, provide the best service to our customers. And I will say we are, very well capitalized too. So, we are in a real prime position here to really execute on our pipeline.
And the value of these partnerships come back to the economics of the services, really infrastructure services that we provide, right? Where's the fixed cost leverage in an airplane? It's putting as many hours on that airplane as you possibly can, irrespective of what is being done with it. So again, our strategy is let's get 100% of the flying that's going to happen in transplant out of a specific geography. We don't care if you're using a device, if you're not using a device, if you're using one of our surgeons, if you're using someone else's surgeon. We want to get the fixed cost leverage because the more hours we put on the airframe, you're amortizing the cost of those pilots, of the insurance, and it costs everybody less. It doesn't make sense to slice up the logistics into captive logistics for this surgeon and then captive logistics for that surgeon and that device and this device. It makes sense to put it all together and make the cost less for everyone. And the same is actually true in our clinical services, right? It makes sense for that surgeon to perform as many recoveries as possible for he or she in that specific geography. Doesn't matter if a device is being used, if NRP is being used, if it's a brain dead donor or a circulatory death donor. We just want to have those surgeons as busy as possible, which allows us to pay the surgeon more, which makes them happy. But then ultimately, if a surgeon's very busy, they're making enough money over the course of the year, and it can be less per case. And that saves money for the whole ecosystem. And of course, if you're saving money, you don't have to fly them around. You can go after more of those organs. So that's why economically, it makes such good business sense for everyone to work with us because we're going to have those lower costs.
Great. Thank you so much for highlighting this out. So you're not the only player, of course. Max, I think you have an interesting question about that.
Yeah, we already touched on the aspect that there are multiple parts in the value chain. And of course, then there are multiple players in every part of it, like logistics, gene perfusion, and clinical services. But rather than focusing on any specific competitor, the question is, how does Strata strategy differentiate itself in this market? And what does that mean for how you win and retain customers?
Well, I think the key aspect is to be able, again, to just be that easy button, to be able to do it in a cost-efficient manner. And the only way you can do that is by having a local footprint or a national footprint in key geographic locations. So you can avoid unnecessary repositioning of airplanes, which costs money. You can avoid having to move surgeons around the country, which is a waste of their time and bad for everybody. Again, you have to be able to say yes to your customer. So being open source, as we call it, or device agnostic or technology agnostic is incredibly important to us and a real key differentiator.
Yeah, great. Amazing.
Very good. Yes, maybe just to jump in there. I think what you touched on is it's very important that basically the customer or the clinic has peace of mind so that they don't have to organize everything by themselves, have the risk, the extra costs and so on. And as you told us, basically have the easy button, let's call it. That's a very good part. So I think in one thing that is also very important and where we'll head over to Simon is the future and what will come next. So Simon, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really interested about it. How Strata could look like in 10 years. And today you highlighted out many different strategies, many different devices your platform can adapt basically. And if the strategy executes as intended over the next decade, is Strata a dominant national platform, in your opinion, that has consolidated these fragmented market you already talked about?
Well, certainly that's true. Certainly we've consolidated. We've made it less expensive to go recover organs for transplant recipients. We've made it more efficient. We've lowered the cost of taking a risk to try to go find a transplant organ. We've done a lot of that already, and we're going to continue to do a better job of that in more places across the country. I think when you look farther out, to the first part of your question, 5 or 10 years out, there's a really exciting opportunity to not only close the gap that we've talked about of the 15 people every day whose lives we can save. We have the technology to do it. There should be enough donors out there. It's just a matter of putting the pieces together well. I think not only can we solve that problem, but then you can move into the millions of other people who are suffering, but can't even be on the transplant list at all because they're either not at risk of dying soon or they have something that disqualifies them. They have cancer, so they can't get an organ transplant. If you close the gap of the folks that are on the list, you can start to help people who are suffering as well. And there's a lot of technology. We're actually involved in some of the clinical trials for what are called xenotransplants. So these are genetically modified animal organs, mostly pig organs, that can be used as a bridge to help patients survive longer to get to a human organ that can save their life. These are in the very early stages, but it's a huge logistical problem to solve because they have to be grown in specialized facilities that are pathogen free. They have to be removed from the animals in those facilities, and then all the same constraints, but in overdrive in terms of preserving them and getting them to the recipient very quickly. So over time, this will increase the supply of organs that are available in America, will close the gap, and there will be no one dying because they don't get an organ that they need. And then we can start solving people's problems with transplant as well. We can start making people's lives better. So you can imagine the number of transplants taking place in America becoming a multiple of what it is today. First, because we have bridge organs coming from animals that allow you to wait an extra 6, 9, 12 months to get the human organ that can be the match and extend your life dramatically. And then when these organs are starting to become a substitute, you can give them to folks that wouldn't even qualify today. So we're really excited to be a part of that ecosystem. It's going to put massive demands on what we do, on what the whole industry does. And by putting that infrastructure layer in place today and continuing to build it, we think we can be the preferred partner of everyone in the industry to solve the problem most efficiently and most cost effectively.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for highlighting that out. It's really exciting what's happening in your business right now. There's so much going on. You're building out the partner network. You focus on getting more devices on the network. To me personally, it sounds like you're kind of building like a one-shop stop for like these organ transplantation infrastructure network. I would describe it like that. So really interesting for highlighting out today all your strategies, your technology, the market in general, and also like the fragmented market, what your company wants to achieve in there. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to address to our audience?
I think you guys covered it very thoroughly. Thanks for all the great questions. Really enjoyed chatting with you, and hope to get to do it again sometime soon.
Sure. Then, thank you very much. Melissa, Matt, Will, it was a pleasure to have you on the show. And we will hopefully keep up in some time. And thank you, of course, to our audience for joining in. And we'll all see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Thank you.